First, I will tell you a little bit about the background for studying night shift work in cancer. After me, Eva Schönhammer, as you all know, will tell you about her experiences with cohort studies. And finally, Pascal Guenel will tell you about his experience with case control studies, in particular the study he has participated in, where 5 different case control studies have been pooled. So, night shift work is a very complex exposure. It's also a very frequent exposure. And during the last about 20 years, there's been a lot of attention in relation to cancer. And there's been a lot of debate. And there have been a lot of meta-studies and reviews related to this. Actually, there are more studies on meta-analysis than original studies. But roughly 1 out of 6 or 7 in both Europe and USA are exposed to this shift work. Shift work is complex. It's something about light at night as a main component, but it's also about other things. Here you have an example of 2 different types of nurses and physicians. They are both exposed to shift work because they're working during the night, but as you see, the light is very different in the 2 situations. Further on, shift work is not only shift work. There needs to be a definition on when you start and when you stop. There are different types of shift work. Some people work shift work each working night, some shift and have it each second day, some shift and have it each third day, and some work for 1 week and have 1 week off. So it's very complex, and that needs to be taken into consideration, of course. Actually, this issue has received another attention after the Nobel Prize 4 years ago gave the prize to 3 American biologists for discovering the circadian rhythms, which is one of the key points in the mechanisms related to night shift work. We epidemiologists never get the Nobel Prize. We are creating evidence, and there's here a hierarchy of evidence that has been published some times ago. You see in the bottom, there's some background information and expert opinions. Then we have the case control studies. And after that, we have cohort studies, which have is anticipated to have a higher quality of evidence. And then, of course, the randomized controlled trials. And on top of this system, we have the systematic reviews. In 2007, 8 studies on breast cancer were published, and you see here the group, and it was evaluated by the IARC monograph group. At that time, 3 cohorts existed. 2 of the cohorts we will hear about later today. It was the nurses' health studies, 1 and 2, and there were 5 case control studies. On average, they pointed to an increased risk of breast cancer, but at that time there was only 8 studies in total. Another group evaluated the experimental animals. At that time there were 55 different studies, and there was sufficient evidence. And the mechanistic studies supported the evidence. So overall, circadian shift work that involves circadian rhythm disruption is probably carcinogenic to humans. That was the evaluation from 2007. So, however, many studies on review and meta-analysis have been published. This is one example where they said, yeah, most studies, most case control studies point to an increased risk, but most cohorts don't, therefore there's no evidence. The most extreme of that kind of evidence-creating studies is studied by Ruth Travis and co-workers that in 2016 concluded that the IARC 2007 shift work review was necessarily based on limited epidemiological evidence, and although further follow-up is desirable, the prospective evidence available shows that classification of night shift work as probably human carcinogen is not longer justified. That was based on all the cohort studies where they have made meta-analysis. And the press release was even stronger. They said that research over the past years suggesting that there was a link has made big attention, and we hope that today's news reassure women who works at night shifts. So what they're saying is that there's no association at all because it's not seen in the cohorts. So a few years later, there was a new evaluation because at that time, 30 different studies on breast cancer had been published, and some studies on prostate and colorectal cancer also. So if you look at the evidence from case control studies and prospective cohorts in the right, you see a clear pattern. Almost all of the case control studies show some association even on the ever-never level, whereas almost none of the cohort studies show an association. So, however, despite this, the IARC 124 monograph concluded that there's a positive association between night shift work and cancer, both related to colorectal cancer and prostate cancer, and in particular to breast cancer. One reason for not saying that there's sufficient evidence was there was some heterogeneity that avoided reasonable exclusion of bias. Said with other words, we didn't have the courage to say that we could make the sufficient evidence based on case control studies alone. But it also stated that the pooled case control study, which Pascal will tell you about, was considered the most informative of the studies at all. And it was also stated that in general, the case control studies were given greater prominence in the overall evaluation because of their much stronger exposure assessment. Finally, this year there was also published another evaluation by another famous institution in the USA, the National Toxicology program, and they also concluded that there's high confidence that persistent night shift work that disrupts the circadian rhythm can cause breast cancer in women and may cause prostate cancer in men, of course. So that was the short introduction, and then I will give the word to Eva Schönhammer, who will tell us about the cohorts.
Yes, thank you very much, Tony. I am just putting up my slides here. I am glad to be able to highlight some of the reasons why we thought that the cohort studies were less advantageous in the overall assessment. And together we have picked 3 examples that I want to discuss today before I hand over to Pascal. I think they reasons why cohort studies could be inferior in the assessment of night work and cancer risk. I will start off with a study by Jones and colleagues, which was making use of the Generations study cohort, and was actually published, I think, while we were still sitting at IARC and doing the evaluation. It came out, and we were still able as a group to look at this paper and assess it for its quality in terms of helping us to decide, and quickly knew that this wasn't going to be helpful. So let me show you why. The general assessment of their shift work is already at the core of one of the bigger problems with the study in terms of its validity. The question how shift work was assessed was phrased this way here. Over the last 10 years, have you had any jobs that regularly involved working late evening or night with a time frame given between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m.? And given the way this was phrased, there is quite a bit of potential for misclassification, because any job that goes until midnight or 1, 2, like bartenders or any type of restaurant waiters, etc., could be falling into this category. And then they had an additional set of questions alluding to the specifics about the shift work per se. As you can see here, it's a large cohort study, over 100,000 women. And the age ranges were quite evenly distributed here at recruitment, but still about half of them were at an age where we now know, or we know since a couple of years, that most women will stop working night shifts at a certain age, usually around in their 50s or later. And these are the main results that they presented, basically looking at one one definition of shift work, which is have you been a night shift worker, yes or no? A very crude assessment, finding no association here. And then for some of the other metrics, also no association, except for some hint that if you have measures of intensity of shift work, you see some modest evaluations of risk here. And so when we look at the totality of the evidence here, it looks like an overall null paper has some indication for a positive association, though not significant for some intensity metrics, which were not, in our view, appropriately highlighted in the paper. But still, you know, that they had these exposure assessments is of value, and that it was a large cohort study as well. However, the limitations are what I already mentioned, the exposure misclassification, which is in a cohort study most likely random, so leading to a bias towards the null. And this is driven by the mixing of evening and night work, essentially also leading to the fact that you will have many past night workers in your reference group, so further biasing the result towards the null. And then some minor concerns about duration and survivor bias, again, basically biasing towards the null. And all of this is wonderfully summarized in a commentary that was published and written by Manolis, who we all know, in the British Journal of Cancer in 2019. The second study that I would like to exemplarily highlight is a cohort study of perhaps less value in the context of night work and breast cancer, is one that Johnny has just mentioned earlier. It's the study by Ruth Travis and her colleagues on shift work and breast cancer, and she actually made use at outset, this looks very impressive, of 3 cohort studies, but each of them, as I want to show you, has major shortcomings. So the biggest perhaps of the 3 cohort studies that she combined in her paper is the Million Women study, where you do have an ever-never night work assessment and also information on duration. And obviously you have lots of breast cancer cases. But if you take a closer look, these women were at enrollment on average 68 years old, so way past any night work exposure. And they were followed only for 2.6 years on average in their retirement years, essentially. That's not appropriate if we want to understand the immediate impact of shift work on breast cancer risk. Second cohort, the EPIC cohort, is also a very large cohort, but again, with a relatively older age at enrollment, basically suggesting that shift work has happened way long ago. And then another ever-never night work assessment, which is a very weak metric, and duration collected, but there's only 1 breast cancer case in that duration assessment. And lastly, the third cohort, the UK Biobank, which is another large cohort study, but it only has information on current jobs that involve night shifts. It has no information on duration, which we generally considered more valuable information. And it also has a pretty advanced age already at enrollment. This is the table they present with what I just mentioned, the baseline age being really rather on the older age for a shift work study. I've just pulled this up here to show you that the predominant occupation in this cohort, especially in the EPIC cohort, was nursing and healthcare. About 50% or more had these types of occupations. And then here is the quick summary of the results they present for the Million Women study participants, where they did have information on duration of shift work and find no association whatsoever. Johnny has already showed that they, based on these data, concluded that basically you no longer have to worry about night work, not even only for breast cancer, but for any cancer, basically throwing out the baby with the bathtub here. What are the strengths of the study? Well, the 3 studies, each of them are large. Some of them have a large number of breast cancer cases, some don't, and they are prospective. the weaknesses by far outweigh these strengths. Speaking about the very simplistic exposure assessment, which is sort of ever never for the most part, then a major problem is that basically they were focusing on older women who were past retirement age for the most part. And we know, and I will show you in the next cohort, that night work may wane. The effect of night work may wane over time once a woman stops working night shifts. So this may not be the appropriate population to study when addressing this question. Then a very short follow-up at maximum 3 years across all 3 populations, and in a time when they are no longer actively working or not working night shifts. And then the low case numbers, essentially prohibiting duration analysis in all but 1 cohort because they didn't have enough cases. And then the third cohort study that I want to mention, which also has weaknesses that I want to highlight, is a study by our own group, the Nurses' Health Studies 1 and 2, which probably many of you know has an exposure assessment, which was designed in 1988, so a long time ago. And for what it is a pretty good assessment, but still from today's perspective, it's a very weak assessment. And it was asking about the total number of years a woman had worked rotating night shifts, which was defined with at least 3 nights per month in addition to days and evenings in a given month. And this was assessed in both cohorts with updates in the Nurses' Health Study 2, but not in the Nurses' Health Study 1. So the shift work distribution in these cohort studies is advantageous because they are all nurses, so all of them work night shifts, or pretty much all of them, and you have a wide range of numbers of duration and exposure assessments. What we found in this 2017 paper, which was published by Lani Wegrzyn and us, is that in the Nurses' Health Study, in the older cohort, there was no association between night work and breast cancer risk, but in the younger cohort, there was a significant, more than doubly increased risk of breast cancer. Now, I want to show you, so here are the specific results, the multivariable adjusted results for the older, the Nurses' Health Study, and then for the younger cohort, this doubly a fold increased risk, which was slightly weaker when looking at cumulatively updated night work. Now, here is the point that is important, and another limitation for the Nurses' Health Study, the older one. You see that the baseline age of these women was also 55 to 60 years. So if you follow them for 24 years, you're basically following them also into retirement, just like I said earlier for the Ruth Travis study. Well, we didn't know at this point. It became clear when looking at the data that that's probably not a good idea, because when we stratified by follow-up to basically look at the shift work exposure that happened closer, or when women were still active, looking at the breast cancer cases that occurred closer to that active time, you still do see an increased risk. But as far as you move further away from the shift work exposure, these risks attenuate. And so the strengths and limitations of the Nurses' Health Study, which was appraised as one of the strongest cohort studies, is on the strength side, it's a single occupation which removes confounding by socioeconomic status. We have good medical information, and there's a consistency in terms of night work throughout their working career. The study was truly prospective, especially in following them through their entire active working years. And because it's such a well-designed study, there's comprehensive ability to control for confounding and to even examine breast cancer by subtypes. What is weak in the study is that only few aspects were captured, essentially duration, a lifetime duration of night work with a specific definition, which will most likely also have biased these results towards the null, suggesting that if that bias wasn't there, the results could have been stronger than as they present themselves. And lastly, there's no information on occupational carcinogens in that cohort. So I want to summarize here, what have we learned from the cohort studies? Well, prospective study design does not automatically translate into good study. It matters how exposure was assessed, and an ever-never type assessment of night work is not good enough for these types of studies. There is a lot of potential for most likely non-differential, so random exposure misclassification, with a good reason to assume that many of the cohort studies are biased towards the null. It matters whether women were followed throughout their active career. And that's something to pay attention to when you examine a cohort study. And because this long follow-up is needed for cancer outcomes, you need to go back in time to find a good cohort study that was forward-thinking and was already 30 years or longer ago designing a study with really good night work assessment. They likely don't exist. I don't know one yet, but they are in the works. And the new cohort studies that have been established more recently have added these exposure metrics that will help make the cohort study stronger. Just listing as an example, the Nightingale study, which was started 10 years ago and will soonish become available for analysis, I suspect. So want to stop here and hand over to Pascal.
Okay, wait, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So so first of all, I want to thank Johnny for inviting me to have this opportunity to talk about the contribution of case control studies to investigate the association between night work and cancer. In this case, more particularly breast cancer. And as an example of this contribution, I will talk about the pooled analysis of 5 population-based case control studies we coordinated some time ago with Émilie Cordina Duverger at the INSAM unit in Villejuif near Paris. So this is the slides that Johnny has shown you already, that shows the results of the case control and prospective cohort studies that were evaluated in the 2019 IARC monograph. And well, I want to stress the fact that, well, the comparability between these studies was hampered by, first, different definitions of night work across these studies. The study population had different night work exposure patterns. Sometimes just they were only on rotating night shift work. And in many of these studies, there were only a few night work exposure metrics that were considered, and mainly, in most of them, only duration or only never exposed. So this is why we decided to conduct a pooled analysis of night work and breast cancer studies. The objective was, of course, first, to increase the statistical power by combining multiple data sets, but also to improve the exposure assessment by using a common definition of night work, by quantifying the most important domains of night work, and by assessing exposure over the entire work history. So to do this, we based our analysis on our study on recommendations for exposure assessment in epidemiological studies that were published by IARC working group in 2011 in OEM, a working group led by Richard Stevens, that recommended to use as a definition of night work work that lasts for at least 3 hours between midnight and 5 a.m. in the morning. And also that recommended to capture different domain of exposure, including, of course, duration, that is the number of years employed in night shift work, but also intensity, that is the number of night shifts per month or per week. Cumulative exposure, like the number of night shifts over the entire work history, the number of consecutive night shifts, and whether the shifts were permanent or rotating. And, well, among other exposure metrics. So, well, to do this, we had to select the studies we would include in this pooled analysis. So we started in 2016, and when we made a PubMed search, we identified about 30 epidemiological studies on night work and breast cancer. And we selected the studies where the lifetime job history was available and where the night work schedules were documented for each job episode. And doing this, we ended up with the 5 population-based case control studies that are shown here. So a study from Australia, Canada, France, Germany, and Spain. And in total, these pooled analysis included over 6,000 cases of breast cancer and 6,900 population controls. So, well, we contacted the study investigators, and so we had 5 data sets that were made in the same way. So with a general questionnaire that provided information on social demographic characteristic, lifestyle, alcohol, tobacco, reproductive factors, and so on. And every case and every control was asked to describe the job she had held for more than 6 months during the work history. And for each job, we got the year of start, the year of end, the occupational title, the industry. And we also asked a question about, where did you work at night? And if yes, the woman was asked whether it was rotating or permanent night shift, the number of nights per week, the time she started working and the time she finished working. And based on this, we got 54,000 job episodes that were recorded. And we looked at whether the night work definition was okay. The night work definition, as I told you, were more than at least 3 hours between midnight and 5 a.m. And we calculated the exposure metrics in an harmonized way, including duration, intensity, the length of the shift, and the cumulative number of nights, for example. And also we calculated the time since last night work for women who stopped working at night at the time of the inclusion. So based on this, I will show you some of the results of this pooled analysis. And overall, for all women, we found that women who ever worked at night, compared to women who never worked at night, had a 12% increased risk of breast cancer, which was at the limit of statistical significance. And then we also, we stratified the sample according to the menopausal status and found that only women who were premenopausal were at increased risk with a odds ratio of 1.26, whereas postmenopausal women had no increased risk. And when we looked at the results by study, by country, we found homogeneous results across these countries, except maybe for Germany, where the confidence interval was large due to small numbers of subjects in this category. So these are the results based on different exposure metrics. So in premenopausal women, we found a strong association of breast cancer risk with the intensity of night work. This is the number of nights per week. So the odds ratio 1.8 in women who worked more than 3 nights per week. And we also found an association with the length of night shift in women who worked night shift of 10 or more hours. But the association with duration of night work was less clear, but no association at all was observed among postmenopausal women. So we also looked at a combination of duration and intensity, and we looked at the effect of duration of night work among women who worked more than 3 nights per week in premenopausal women, and found that the odds ratio increased with duration of night work among women with a high intensity of night work. But no association was found in women with the duration, in women with low intensity of night work. And no association, again, was observed among postmenopausal women. We also looked at the odds ratio by time since last night shift. So we categorized the women according to the time since last night shift. And in this category 0 to 2, there are women who are current night workers. And we see that among premenopausal women, there is an association with breast cancer risk, which is significant only among women who are current night workers who stopped working at night for less than 2 years, but then the risk decreased with duration, with time since last night shift. And again, no association at all among postmenopausal women. So this paper was published in 2018, so you can find the detailed results in this paper. So as a summary of the study results, well, so we found that breast cancer risk was associated with night work in premenopausal women with an increased risk of 26% for ever night work. And this association was more pronounced for high exposure intensity, above 3 nights per week, for long exposure duration, above 10 years, and for extended night shift length, above 10 hours of shift. And this association with breast cancer was observed in current or recent night workers only. But none of these association was seen in postmenopausal women, and we believe a possible explanation is that postmenopausal women had stopped working at night for a longer time than premenopausal women, because many of these postmenopausal women in our study were retired, so they didn't work at night for, they haven't worked at night for many years. And as a discussion, what we can say is that the strength of the study relied mainly on a detailed assessment of exposure, which is based on a case control study design. And we used that night work definition, which was associated with clear misalignment of the circadian clock with the light-dark cycle. We had information on work time schedules over the entire work history, and we used various exposure metrics, including duration, intensity, and of course, we had a large sample size for case control studies. Of course, we had also limitations because we had possible selection bias of cases and controls and possible recall bias, and these biases are, well, similar to all case control studies. But for the selection bias, we believe that all 5 studies that we included used very careful design and very careful selection procedures. So this bias should be minimized. And of course, we had also possible recall bias, but we believe it's unlikely to play an important role for self-declared occupations and work time schedules. So at the end, this study was included in the 2019 IARC monograph, and it was considered to have suggestive evidence that night work may lead to breast cancer. So, and well, I wish to acknowledge all the participants that are shown on this slide. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot to both Eva and Pascal. Although I have heard those stories before, I was impressed of your presentation here. It's very interesting, actually. So now we have about 20 minutes for discussion. I don't know if anybody has an opening question. Then I could have one myself. This was about breast cancer and shift work. Can it be generalized to other cancers or even to other diseases than cancer that tend to be a better assessment of the exposure in case control studies than in cohort studies?
Well, I think, Johnny, currently that is the case because the cohort studies have been established that those ones that are being used for examining cancer endpoints, they tend to have been established some time ago, or if not, then they have the shortcomings like the Million Women study or the EPIC cohort, where you have very short follow-up still. You trump the issue with power because it's large, so you have lots of cases, but it's short follow-up. So I think we're getting closer to a point where we will soon have some higher quality cohort studies. But at the moment, I think this would still apply for most cancers with some variation, most likely depending on the lag time that it takes from exposure to the cancer to develop. Most cancers do have a rather lengthy lag time. And so it's the same issue probably for most of them.
Yeah, and what is your opinion about other diseases like coronary heart diseases or accidents or whatever?
That I think is different. And we do see that also in the nurses' health study, for instance. Celine Better published a paper on cardiovascular disease in shift workers, and the duration it takes apparently for the circadian disruption and effects to impact your cardiovascular disease risk is shorter. She could already demonstrate after 5 years of shift work exposure significantly increased risks. And on the plus side, the risk may also go away sooner if you stop the exposure. It's a little bit like adjusting your lifestyle. You can see a pretty quick impact on your cardiovascular disease risk, whether you change your diet or whatever. And so it seems to be similar for night work. And so for the big disease endpoints like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, there's certainly a difference in terms of the length of a study you need. And there, some of the cohort studies I just criticized could be useful. On the other hand, they need to make sure that the exposure is still happening and we are not past the time when night shift work happened in a woman's life.
What is your opinion, Pascal?
I think, of course, the mechanism might be completely different for cardiovascular disease and cancer. So, but I think that one interesting result of well, the pooled analysis and of maybe the NHS2 study is that there might not be a very long latency period between exposure and cancer. Because, well, in the pooled analysis, we observed an association for, sorry. Okay, sorry. We observed a very short, we observed that the risk of breast cancer increased for women who were still exposed, and that the risk decreases very rapidly after a cessation of exposure. Of course, this has to be confirmed by other studies, but I think it's an important result.
I have another question for you, Pascal. You did an enormous job in order to harmonize the shift work you told about 40,000 different jobs. Did you make an analysis where you kept the old assessment, a pooled analysis?
You mean a meta-analysis based on the on the published results? Yeah, we did that, and the results went to the same direction, but they were less clear. So I think that it was very important to make this harmonization of the data to decrease exposure misclassification, and I think it was a very long job and difficult, but I think it was worth doing it.
Yeah, actually, that's the limitation by all the meta-analysis that exists, that they have different exposures, so they're not comparable.
Because the definition of night work were completely different between the 5 studies. So
I think we have some questions now. John Cherry has a question. Maybe you can pose it by yourself. It's about job exposure matrices.
Yeah, thank you all for the very interesting presentations. One message that came through to me very strongly was that reliable exposure assessment was a really important development in this area. So I was asking, what are the possibilities for data-driven light at night GEMS or algorithmic approaches to retrospective exposure assessment, as has been done in relation to chemical exposures?
Yeah, maybe I can start. Actually, my first study was based on a job exposure matrix. I think I would never have done that again, but it was the first study. I think the night shift work exposure is much more complex than the chemical exposures we normally use for job exposure matrices. Yeah, I think that's my experience.
Yeah, well, I agree. Well, I don't think we can have very good exposure assessment using a job exposure matrix, because if we use occupational titles, for example, so you may have some of the workers exposed to night work, some other who would not be exposed. And then I think it would introduce exposure misclassification. Unless, well, I don't know very good and very detailed job exposure matrices that could be equivalent to exposure assessments that you can have by using detailed questionnaires, for example.
Yeah, and there's some unforeseen exit from night shift work for many different reasons that you cannot adopt to a job exposure matrix, I think.
Johnny, I have a question, if I may ask.
Eva, yeah, please.
One thing that is interesting to me and has always been is this very strong effect modification by menopausal status that you observe in the case control study, Pascal. And I was just wondering, I don't have a really good explanation, unless perhaps there's a biological reason for it, or that menopausal status coincides with when women stop working night shifts. And perhaps in the case control study, I was just thinking, we don't see that strong of a difference in the Nurses' Health study, for instance, between pre and post-menopausal women. But maybe the women in Europe stop working generally earlier, so that menopause coincides with stopping working more so in Europe than, let's say, in the US? Or what other explanations could there be for this difference?
Well, to me, I'm not sure that's the difference we observe between pre and postmenopausal women is due to menopausal status in itself. But well, our hypothesis is it's more probably due to the fact that women, postmenopausal women, had stopped working at night for a longer time than premenopausal women who are still active and working at night. So,
and it's conceivable that this perhaps starts earlier in Europe, right? I know the average retirement age in my country, in Austria, is below 60 for women, maybe 58. But it's definitely, I think, higher in the United States. Maybe there's something that factors in here as well, that they continue working slightly longer, and therefore menopausal status coincides better with working night shifts in Europe, let's say, than in the United States.
Yeah, it's possible, yeah, but well, it's difficult to test these hypotheses because, well, we have, well, apparently the night shift work pattern is different between Europe in our studies, between France, Germany, and Spain, as they are in Canada and Australia. But, well, we didn't make formal comparisons between these countries, so it's
But it could be interesting to find out because there's this difference with the nurses' health study.
Yeah. Yes, sure. Sure, we would be happy to well to use this data set that was very complicated to build for further analysis, of course. Yeah. But then when we stratify by country and so on, then we are very limited by well, statistical power, of course. That's,
yeah, even you have over 6,000 cases.
Yeah, yeah.
Michelle, you have a question, I think.
Thanks. Just a quick question. So it seems that risk declines after you stop working night shifts, but what is the message that we could tell women who are currently working in night shifts, who need to continue working in those shifts, that may be concerned about their health risk?
Michelle, I think the same still applies what was true maybe 15 years ago, which is that there tend to be so many other things that are known cancer risk factors that perhaps these women may pay particular attention to these other things, get their mammography screening regularly done, for instance, or make sure that they watch their weight or don't smoke or don't drink alcohol. These other things where there's much more consolidated evidence already. And then you know, I don't think we have yet reached the point where any policy changes will be made with regards to night work and cancer risk, except for Denmark. Well, Johnny can speak to that, right?
Yeah, in Denmark, the authorities suggest women and men that they don't have night shift work too long a period, and that they only have they have 3 shifts in a row during a week.
So fewer than 3 shifts is what they recommend?
3 as the maximum, I think it is. Yeah, so that avoids permanent night shift where you have it each day or each night.
Yeah.
But it's only a recommendation.
Yeah, so for the time being, I think we're not in a good position to make hard recommendations there other than pointing to the evidence and making sure that you have all other things in order. If you have to work night shifts, don't gain weight, you know, just be even more mindful about any potential cancer risk factors.
Yeah. Where we are. So we have not heard some opinions, which is in contrast to what we have heard, that cohort studies should be better than case control studies. That could be interesting to hear.
Johnny, I have a question. This is Kyriaki here.
Yeah,
Hi.
hi. Kyriaki.
Hi there. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the very interesting talks. I was just thinking while we were discussing exposure-based classification and thinking back on the question on GEMS. And well, while I do agree that GEMS might have higher exposure misclassification than when we collect individual shift work information, I tend to also think that sometimes we collect, like in the case control studies, we have collected this very detailed shift work information, which we then end up collapsing in a single definition because we also need a consensus. And Pascal showed us how in the pooled analysis, we used the common definition, but that definition is also not good enough in my view. So it's not covering the complexity of the different shift systems that we find in the population. So how good are we doing? Is this the best we can do when we need to capture the complexity of shift work? And like the definition we used was working for 3 hours from midnight to 5, but someone that starts working at 3 wouldn't classify as a night worker.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, how good are we doing with this definition? So this is just my question, and a little bit not just want to hear your thoughts and whether you agree or not, and what's the way ahead towards capturing the information, but also using it to an extent that we can make useful recommendations for different shift schedules and so on.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're not at the end yet, but in your large study, you have the possibility to make other kind of night shift work definitions. For instance, those starting 3 o'clock. Although I expect that it would be a very small group, but anyway, you have the opportunity to do it if you have the time. Yeah, it has also been said that those starting very early, which means 5 or 6, that should be even worse than those starting about midnight because the circadian disruption might be higher.
Yeah, well, I agree. Well, this definition is not perfect. It's not the only one we could use, but well, I think it might be very difficult to look in much more details unless you have a very large population to study, because if you want to look at the effect of each specific pattern of night work, then you might end up with very small number of people. So I think it's very difficult. But yeah, I agree. Well, this definition is one definition among many others that could be used. But
yeah, I see now that Emily, the first author, actually have a comment. Please, Emily. You can unmute if.
Yeah, that's
right. I just wanted to add that we tested some others definitions, and the results were quite identical. So the 2 others definition we tested were the a night shift were overnight. It means that we tested with 5 hours between 5 hours of night shift work between midnight and 5 a.m. And we also tested another definition with only 1 hour of night of work between midnight and 5 a.m. And all the results were quite identical.
Yeah, we have actually also tried that attempt for a study in the Nordic countries, and it didn't change the groups very much if we changed the stop and end time for night shift work. But there might be something. I don't know if we have more questions because we are running out of time. Overall, to conclude, I think it's probably not that much difference if we make a case control study or cohort study, but the key issue is to have a good exposure assessment, and it's easier to get a good exposure assessment in a case control study than in cohort studies. And that follows well, I think, the conclusion from the last meeting, where Deborah Glass talked about quality of exposure assessment. That's the key in all epidemiological studies, independent of the design, I think. I don't know if somebody has a last comment. Maybe Ingrid has something to tell us. Ingrid is our big boss.
There. Okay,
Wow,
yes.
sunny.
Sunny, yes. Thank you so much for this very interesting webinar. And thank you for everyone participating. I think this was, yeah, we are used to thinking that cohort studies are the best, but you have shown us that it may not be true always. Thank you for everyone participating, and we will have another webinar at the end of June, 29th of June, I think. I'm not so sure about the topic, the detailed topic. It's something about exposure assessment. Do you want to supplement me, Michelle?
So I think the topic in June is going to be about job exposure matrices and different, a bit of a historical perspective and comments on their development. And I guess the content comes from the OmegaNet training school that was held in 2019 on exposure assessment.
So please join us for the next webinar in about 3 weeks.
We will.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.